So our panel today really is about exploring, the rise in cybersecurity attacks across during the time of the pandemic. Threats have increased because of advancement in artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques. All that has helped businesses, but at the same time, cyber attackers are using more sophisticated ways of breaching security. So we have some experts here today, and we want to look at what are the key threats facing this sector, what are some measures that you could put into place to mandate, or I would say mitigate some of those risks, and what do we see as sort of the future in cybersecurity in this place. And I thought instead of me introducing each of you, it would be more interesting if you maybe offered a brief introduction. I don't think everybody here is familiar with it. The sector, they have different kind of, I would say there's some stereotypes about cybersecurity and hackers. So it would be interesting to start with a brief, like a layman's description. But before we go into that, I wanted you to also introduce yourself briefly to the audience. My name is Zahra Shah. I'm the co-founder of Seers, which is a leading privacy and consent management platform. And Oz will introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Alashe. I'm the CEO and founder of CybSafe. And we're a cybersecurity software platform that is focused on the human aspect of cybersecurity. So we help organizations influence the decisions and the behaviors of their people and understand what that means for the risk that they carry and how they can reduce that risk over time.
Thanks, Oz. Hi, everyone. I'm James Chappell. I'm co-founder and chief innovation officer at a business called Digital Shadows. At Digital Shadows, we help our customers identify and mitigate digital risk by giving them relevant threat intelligence and information about digital risks around them.
Perfect. So Oz, perhaps we could start with sort of a description of how you perceive cybersecurity, and then we could move on to the key risks and kind of addressing, initially starting off with how those risks have increased.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Zara, for two reasons. One, because I think actually when it comes to cybersecurity and when we think about cybersecurity, I think actually quite a few people switch off. And they switch off because they think it's not relevant for them. They think it doesn't actually apply to them. And actually in the fintech context, that's rarely the case. But actually with the individuals within organizations, that's often the case. And so I think just understanding that cybersecurity is about the security as it applies to, and the resilience as it applies to networks, systems, and data. So anything that effectively touches all of those different aspects, the security of those things is key, and of course is obvious in a business context, but not necessarily always so obvious in an individual context. If you consider increasingly digitized, increasingly interconnected, and increasingly interdependent society, really that means that all of us are engaged in some form of good or bad level of cybersecurity, one way, shape, or form.
That's a great summary, and I just add to what Oz is saying there. We often use the sort of three definitions of cybersecurity as confidentiality, keeping your secret secret, protecting things like your customer data from being stolen or being lost. Integrity, so making sure that when you put your identity or brand online, it is genuinely you and not some fraudster trying to get between you and your customer. And then availability, thinking about the systems being available and not disrupted so you can continue to deliver service to your customers. Also, James, it might be helpful if you also kind of introduce briefly yourself and Digital Shadows so people can see the context. Yeah, sure. So I'm really fascinated by, I've worked in cybersecurity for about 20 years, similar to Oz, a very long time working in the industry. I'm fascinated by these new risks that come from digital transformation. All businesses have a digital footprint. That's a good thing. It helps you interact with customers, helps you conduct your business. But because of the use of new technology, there's new types of risk. We call that the digital shadow. And it's looking at identifying things like data loss, reuse of passwords, looking at how brand and identity is disrupted online. We help our customers detect that and help them to fix it when it arises. Thank you for that. What do you think are the key reasons that cybersecurity threats and attacks almost doubled during the pandemic?
I touched on it earlier on when I suggested that as a society we are increasingly digitized, we are increasingly interdependent, and we are increasingly digitized, interdependent, and interconnected. And for those three reasons alone, even before the pandemic, cybersecurity was increasing in terms of importance, increasing in terms of understanding, and our businesses, our organizations, really did understand what it meant to need to have access to information, data, networks, and systems when we needed them. But the pandemic, of course, accelerated quite a lot of the change that has taken place, and as I said, was actually occurring before the pandemic. And so what we saw during the pandemic were organizations who were in part engaging, but not necessarily making the most of the digital opportunity, really lean into it. Not just because it was an opportunity, but because they had to in order to be operational. And so, unsurprisingly, what that has meant is that organizations have not only relied even more on digital assets, technologies to deliver what they do, but cyber criminals have found increasing amounts of opportunities to deliver what they do. And of course, the fact is most cyber criminals are after information, they're after money, or they're after monetizing access to the information. And the reality is that becomes, to a degree, easier when looking at the digital footprint that we've just described and the digital shadow that James has just talked about. This is not going away. So even though this has been accelerated by the pandemic, the fact of the matter is the opportunity that digitization brings is key. The ability for organizations to solve genuine problems for customers is only going to increase and is a good thing, but it does mean that we need to take security and actually cyber resilience, which of course is different to security, which is about recovering from, responding to, learning from incidents when they happen. That's really key.
Another thing that also increased the risk was because as we moved towards remote working, a lot of the computer equipment is, completely isolated from where you would previously have worked, which has made it harder to kind of, secure your or maintain, actually not just security, but privacy as well. Data privacy is a massive issue, which Seers has been working on. How do, employees and companies put in practice measures to protect, not just passwords, but actually their secrets, database, consent, user consent, basically privacy also. It's these two areas that we realized now more in the pandemic are very, very interrelated because of remote working.
It's a really interesting point that you raise. One of the areas we've seen the biggest change in this time is where companies are developing code or producing software. And of course, just in a day, all of the processes around that changed. And there's some really good things about that, because the collaboration tools that developers use to produce that software are really powerful and really enable a lot of these remote working relationships. But using those new tools, sometimes there were new considerations, such as, how were the privacy settings set on those tools? How is the code sort of protected when it's on a GitHub share, for example? And what we found is a lot of organizations did the switch, but without doing the usual diligence they would do in securing that data. So really, the same rules apply to this new working environment. We still need to have that diligence to make sure that we're protecting data appropriately. It is unfortunate that we have seen a broader number of secrets, usernames and passwords to things leaked online. We've seen access to developer tools incorrectly configured, or indeed sort of places where the data is stored incorrectly configured. And unfortunately, a lot of the attackers are now using tools just to scan the internet and having an opportunistic approach to disrupting businesses. So it still needs thinking through, even though we're remote. And unfortunately, as you sort of allude to, Oz, and as you mentioned from a privacy perspective, there have been a lot more events as a result.
Definitely, and the regulators are actually becoming very, very, serious in terms of enforcement as well, all across Europe, I would say.
Absolutely. I think again, it's impossible to really consider this issue without thinking about the impact on the system as a whole. And as much as there is huge opportunity, there is increasing risk because, as I've said, the interconnected nature of some of these issues. So many organizations who are doing what they do today rely on third parties, really good, obvious, and actually quite important macro issue at the moment, third party assurance, and how we know whether the organizations that we are trusting with our information, that we rely on to help us deliver the services we do, take looking after their networks and systems and data as seriously as we do. It's really quite hard to assure yourself of that if you yourself don't quite understand the level and the standard that you might choose to be need to set for yourself, let alone for a third party. So you see the kind of, as you say, blurring together between issues that have kind of sometimes been kept apart, privacy, security, maybe even looking at the kind of ethics of what you should expect for other people in regards to how much of your data as an organization they have access to. But the reason I think this is so interesting right now is because, as I said, this is only going to accelerate, this is only going to increase, and cyber criminals are only going to double down on this increasingly obvious way of conducting their criminal activity.
Interesting. There's another area which has sort of impacted the whole security landscape is ransomware. And there was in recent discussions between President Biden and President Putin, there are a lot of, unfortunately, I mean, this is very much stereotyping, but Russian-speaking criminals, have been involved in this space. Would you like to comment on that and kind of the impact of that on the whole kind of landscape, the ecosystem?
I guess it's a geopolitical. It's become a geopolitical issue. I think what's really interesting about ransomware is it's still actually the same old weaknesses that are being exploited, but just in a slightly different way. The attackers themselves are still opportunistic, so it's not like they've got some magic wand that allows them to magically break into organisations. It's still the same weaknesses that were a problem before. The problem is that they've just become more sophisticated in the way they exploit those weaknesses, and the criminality has scaled and become a commercial. I mean, we talk about sort of almost like venture capital funding of crime. The size of the ransoms are so large, it's almost like they have their own VCs to scale their operation, which is crazy. So it's been really. I'm personally very worried about this situation. You might think cybersecurity company, oh, great, more risk. Actually, quite the opposite. We really want to see a reduction of this because it's killing business. Businesses can't survive in this environment for long. So we need to get a handle on this. We need to reduce it. And I kind of heartened to see. I mean, it's fair to say that the Russophone. There's a lot of Russian-speaking actors in this space. It doesn't necessarily mean they're from the Russian Federation or the CIS countries, but what we do know is that the role that law enforcement plays in that is something that governments can control, and therefore they should form part of the bilateral discussions between nations. And it feels appropriate that Biden should be talking to Vladimir Putin about their role from a law enforcement perspective.
Given that we have very little time left, so two other key areas I wanted to kind of cover quickly. One is, how could companies start mitigating this risk? Maybe potentially through regular audits, through staff training, and also identifying some of the common mistakes that they make. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, absolutely. The holy triumvirate when looking at a cyber risk or indeed a cyber resilience strategy largely revolves around people, process and technology. And so in many ways, there are a variety of standards that organizations could choose to adhere to. ISO 27001 is a really good example here in the UK. We're fortunate because the UK government has helped produce another standard called the Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus, which kind of gives a baseline level and a start point. I would always point at those as really useful start points because they include some of the things that you've just described. Vulnerability assessments, regular audits, making sure that your people have conducted security awareness training and you're focused on influencing their security behaviours and understanding those risks, all encapsulated within those standards. There is a list of things to go through, and some people would look at that list and think it's quite complicated, but there is no shortage of self-help that can be delivered and no shortage of third parties who will help you deliver against it. And the key thing is making sure that those third parties actually know what they're doing.
James, would you like to comment?
I think approaching your network and systems as if you were the attacker is a really good way to think about it and think about what you're protecting, who you're protecting it from, and what they're likely to do to get between you and your customer or to get to the data that you hold. So it's really good to sort of put yourself in the shoes of either your customer or the attacker and take that perspective on it rather than just sort of following. I think regulations are very important, so it is really important to follow those, but it's not just the checklist, it's about thinking the problem through, thinking about that risk and really getting to the bottom of it.
I agree. I think the only thing I'd add to that is also, the strict regulation as well is becoming stricter, and then enforcement is becoming stricter. So I think for employees across organizations, it's important to actually train on the key obligations under those key privacy regulations, like GDPR is the most important, because it gives them, in addition to Cyber Essentials, some tools that they need to follow when they're coming up with these processes, procedures, and methodologies. Finally, what do you see future trends in the cybersecurity landscape? And what should people be doing to kind of, being better prepared?
I guess, unfortunately, I think we're going to see and hear about a lot more large-scale cyber incidents that impact not just one organization, but a variety of organizations within that supply chain, and indeed, actually, aspects of society that we have taken for granted for quite some time. Whether looking at the US and the recent attack on the Colonial Pipeline, the incidents that impacted the Irish Health Services recently, those types of incidents are going to increase. What does that mean, and why is that the case? Well, it's because of the commercialization and the ease with which cyber criminals are commercializing what they do, and therefore one of the trends, whether that's the application of advanced technologies to make attacks easier, or indeed actually the application of cognitive computing technologies to help us identify vulnerabilities, identify different threats, or identify changes in behavior that would impact risk. I think we're going to kind of see this tit for tat between the application of advanced technologies in that space. What can organizations do about it? As I've said, I think really firstly recognizing that we all have a part to play and actually this impacts us all, and then taking a view that says, how am I going to impact the confidentiality, the integrity and the availability of the things that I hold dear, I think is absolutely key. And as I would point back to these standards. These standards are good. If you don't know where to start there.
James?
I just really echo a bit of what Oz said. So threats are certainly going to get more sophisticated and broader. I completely agree with that. I think it's really interesting. We talked about this digital quickening at the beginning of today's sessions. I think our investment in technology will create new opportunities for attackers. So the need to keep pace with that is important. I think the good news is that actually some of the defence options that businesses have for them are also becoming much more agile, much easier to fit around businesses, and I think that's quite heartening. It's very easy to sort of go, the threat's really bad, scary threat, but actually the defence is really exciting as well, and there's lots of opportunities about making that defence quicker to respond and react to this very quickly changing landscape.
Thank you very much. If you have any further questions, things you want to cover in more detail, we're all on LinkedIn. You could get in touch, because I know it's a little bit short on time today. I mean, there's so much more we can discuss, but I know we have other speakers. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to James and Oz. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.